Did that sound like I had 10 minutes to study this morning? I usually only study for like 3 minutes, but I had 10 on that. So tonight I'm going to speak on what I was going to speak on this morning. That's really why I was bringing that up. We're going to look at the wise men in the Christmas account. I think we sung tonight, We Three Kings. We're going to see if there's three of them, and we're going to see if they were kings. Right, Jordan? He looked at me and he said, I don't think that the Bible even says they're kings. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So Matthew chapter 2. We'll be in Matthew chapter 2, and we'll look at some truths down through there about the wise men and their trek to see Jesus. So Matthew chapter 2, and we'll pick up in verse number 1. So Matthew chapter 2, verse number 1, it says, Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. We'll stop there for a second. Let me give you a little background on Herod. He was not a good guy. As a matter of fact, he was a paranoid schizophrenic. That's what it says. That's how history remembers Herod the Great. He had achieved his power largely by climbing over the dead bodies of his opponents, rivals, and even family. He even killed his wife, thinking she was plotting against him. He thus had a continual fear of being betrayed and overthrown by everyone around him. Therefore, it was not out of character for him to kill all the infants in and about Bethlehem if he thought a rival had been born. And we're going to see that later on in the account. Herod's cruelty was legendary. Caesar Augustus once said he would rather be Herod's dog than Herod's son. Because probably Herod's dog would be safer than Herod's son. So that's who Herod is. And then it says, Behold, there came wise men. And by the way, I believe that the King James translated that word well. The Greek word is magos. It is Persian, or it's a Persian word also, and it's their scientists, it would be their university instructors, it would be theologians along those lines. So the well-educated men of Persia is what that word means. So wise men is a good translation that we see in the King James. So would you say wise men were kings? Didn't we just hear about a king? Did he sound wise? Herod was not wise. It says now in the days of Herod the king. And so just because you're a king doesn't mean you're wise. And just because you're wise doesn't mean you're a king. And so, Jordan, does that answer the question or the statement? The Bible doesn't call them kings. It doesn't refer to them as kings. Not even the original word does it refer to kings. And so, whatever the name of the three kings are that tradition gives them, they're not kings. All right? And I don't believe there were three. We'll get to that in just a minute. I'm sorry if I'm busting your bubble. There's no Easter Bunny and there's no Santa Claus either. Welcome to church. Be merry and stay that way. All right, verse 2. So the wise men came from the east to Jerusalem. They came to Herod in verse 2 saying, Where is he that is born the King of the Jews? For we have seen a star in the east and are come to worship him. When Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So let's stop there for a second. So if there's three, now why does tradition say three? Easy answer. The three gifts. That's why tradition say three kings or three wise men, because there were three gifts. However, when they came into Jerusalem, 3 wise men from the east would not necessarily get an audience with Herod the king, number one. Number two, 3 wise men walking into Jerusalem would not cause the whole city to be in a stir. However, if it was a great company of men that came in from the east, and they were theologians, and they were university instructors, and they were doctors, and they were scientists, they would probably get an audience with the king. And so we see here a little bit of evidence that maybe we ought to not get our Christmas traditions from a hymn or songs or traditions. We ought to look at the scriptures. Another thing to think about, and I think I'm gonna mention this in a little bit. How far did the wise men have to travel from the east to Jerusalem? We're talking about maybe from Babylon. Thousand miles-ish. Would it be safe for 3 guys to travel? Or would it be safer for a great company of men to travel over bandit-infested areas? I mean, you're carrying gold and frankincense and myrrh. Don't you think it's going to be more than just 3 guys on camels? Do you guys have a brain out there? Welcome to church. Aren't you glad you came? Aren't you glad you came? All right, in verse number 4. And when they had gathered all the chiefs and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. By the way, this is Herod calling all of the wise men of his country. And of course, they quote to him. By the way, here's the important thing. You remember this morning how I mentioned in the Greek Christ had the article, and so it's the Christ? It's the same occasion here. Where is the Christ? Where is the Messiah? And the interesting thing to me in verse number 5 is they had an answer. Where is the Christ? Where is the Messiah of the Old Testament? Where is he that was born? Where is the Christ? And the wise men of Jerusalem. So wise men of Jerusalem would be the scribes, the Pharisees, the ones that Jesus are going to come up against later on. By the way, the one that will come up later on and say, well, tell everybody that Jesus' disciples stole the body out of the tomb. Tell them this is not the Christ. Those same guys had an answer. Verse number 5. And they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, and thou Bethlehem in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah? For out of thee shall come a governor, and he shall rule my people Israel. See, they had an answer. By the way, they just quoted Micah 5:2. If you want to write that down in your notes, here's Micah 5:2. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me he that it is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth have been from old, from everlasting. And so, when the wise men asked Herod asked the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes and the Pharisees had an answer from Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. They had an answer. Verse number 7. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. And when they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. Boy, we ought to talk about this star for a moment, shouldn't we? We ought to talk about this Christmas star. ancient aliens wants to say that it was Jupiter and Mars and Venus and the moon lined up, and it made a bright star up in the sky to signify the birth of some special occasion. By the way, if Jupiter and Saturn and Mars and Venus line up and the moon line up, does it make the planet brighter? No. We're only going to see one. It doesn't like multiply the light that's reflected and goes blang. Right? It doesn't do that. And so not wise men said that theory. However, in the scriptures, we have angels referred to as the morning stars, or stars of the, they're referred to as stars. I wonder if it could be an angel. So here it is. Jesus Christ is born in the manger in Bethlehem. And above that might be an angel. And the glory of the Lord, or at least the reflected glory of God, shone off of that angel. And that's what those men saw. Stick with me for a second. I'm going to prove my point. So let's say that happened. So the wise men leave Babylon and they head towards Bethlehem. He's born in the manger. By the time the wise men show up, is he still a babe in the manger? Well, the important thing to notice in the passage here, and we haven't gotten there yet, verse number 11, it says, and when they were coming to the house. Do you guys see that in verse number 11? So when the wise men show up at the house. Now the manger was a what? A stable on the backside of an inn. All right? But then the wise men left Jerusalem and headed to Bethlehem, to the house. So some time has elapsed, and we're going to talk about the time in just a minute again. But time has elapsed since they saw the star until the time they arrived. But in between, they come to Jerusalem because when a star is in the sky and it's really bright, really, what is it pointing at? It's kind of a direction, right? So from the east, they see a star in the west, and they start going west towards the star. And so they come to Jerusalem. They have writings. We're going to get into that. They have teachings. We're going to get into that. There's the assumption here that it's going to be in Jerusalem because that's where the king of Israel is going to be. So they head to Jerusalem. And then when they're done with Herod, again, look at verse number 9. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star, which they saw in the east, so the same star, went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. It almost seems like it moved out of space, dropped down into the atmosphere, and kind of led those wise men and stood right over the house, because a star that's up in the sky or in space is not going to signal one house, is it? But if it's not Jupiter and Saturn and Venus and Mars and the moon lined up, it's not an astrological thing, but it's a living thing, and he's the guide, he's naturally going to come down and say, here's the house. And that's what happens. Because we don't hear of the Magi going from door to door looking for where the young child was, do they? It came and stood over where the young child was. Verse number 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. Boy, it says young child there too, doesn't it? When we talk about the child in the manger, what do we always say? The babe in the manger. The babe that's in the manger, don't we? Because he was a baby there. But in this house is a young child, is it not? And he's in a house. And when they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, fell down and worshiped, and I underlined that word, him. You know who they did not worship? They did not worship Mary, but they worshiped him, Jesus Christ. The verse continues on and says, when they had opened the treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And so there's the three gifts, and we'll talk about that again in a moment. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth unto Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and the mother and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt. By the way, how did he pay for that trip?
Recent deposit.
He just got a gift of gold. Do you think Joseph had the means and the money to take his family all the way from Bethlehem to go down into Egypt? Certainly not, but the Lord knew about that. Verse 15, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, out of Egypt, or saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. By the way, you'll find that in Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. All right? And so that's where we find that saying. Then verse 16, Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. All right, let's go into a little bit of history lesson here. This will be the non-biblical portion of this. This will be the historical portion of that. So the idea here from verse number 16 is that was the outside number that Herod figured from when the star appeared to the wise men until he was deceived of the wise men and realized that he was deceived of the wise men. And so he did some arithmetic, which is one of the 3 R's that we should learn in school. Okay, reading, writing, arithmetic. By the way, only one of those starts with an R. See, I graduated public school. I know stuff. And so the outside time period, age that Jesus Christ could be would be 2 years old. So he's a young child. The earliest he could be is 40 days. But now let's think about it. Babylon was about 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem. And then I think Bethlehem, if I remember right, it's either 8 or 16 miles away from Jerusalem. Do you guys remember the right number? It's like that far. Okay, it's not far at all. I think it's a day's journey, so that'd be about 8 miles. So how long would it take if they traveled 8 miles in a day, because again, that's the average travel time, and they saw the star the day that he was born, how long would it take them to travel 1,000 miles? Anybody have their calculator with them? If it was I'm still going to go with 8 miles a day. So there's 365 days in a year. Multiply that by 8 and see how many miles you get. 8 miles a day, 365 days in a year. Okay, so we're going about 1,000, so a third of that. So a third of a year. 4 months? Yep, 4 months. All right, 4 months they traveled. So at 4 months old, is the babe still a babe? Could be. Yep, could be. But it says the house and the young child. So maybe it took them a little bit longer to get there. Maybe they saw his star in the east, and it took a little while for them to gather the troops together in Babylon and then take a 4-month trek. And they went to Jerusalem first and stayed there however many days. So then by the time that they got to Bethlehem, they worshiped the young child in its house, and then they departed and left. And it doesn't tell us how long it took them to leave before Herod found out. But all of that stuff happened in that time period. So the outside number here would be 2 years old. That's why it says in verse 16 that Herod killed every child from 2 years and under, to make sure that he could get all of them. So it took them time. Also, there's more than 3, and I gave that reason. It would be because of the bandits that were in the way. In order for them to get an audience with the king, it would have to be, in order for them to be a great stir in Jerusalem, it would have to be a great troop. So it had to be more than just 3. But how did these wise men know about the birth of Christ? They're in Babylon. How did they know? Yeah, who lived in Babylon, who was a Jew for the longest amount of time? Daniel, who was like the wise one of the wise ones. And so do you think that he would have done any teaching about Almighty God? By the way, did he not do that directly to Nebuchadnezzar? And by the way, I believe at the end of the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar shows himself as a saved man. God's the only God that there is. And there is no other God save the God of Daniel. And he writes down, it's almost like he's saying, I got saved. But who else was in Babylon? Now you'll have to remember this from our first card game that we did. All right, so that's part of Daniel. So let's say Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were all in the same time frame. Who came after them that was still in Babylon? Who was Esther's uncle? Mordecai. What was Mordecai? Jew. All right, so hold your place here. We'll be back in just, well, you don't even have to hold your place here. We're not coming back. Turn with me to Esther 2. I want to show you something really cool. Esther chapter 2. Let me show you something. Can I show you something cool? Is that okay? Can we do that in church? Esther chapter 2. So you guys know the first Esther chapter 1, right? The story there. Ahasuerus is given a feast. He invites Vashti to come over and show off her beauty to all of the men because he's given this feast. It lasted half a year, and then he was given another feast. It was like another week long, and it was at the end of that feast that he kind of has Vashti come over and shows her beauty off, and she says no. Then the men of the kingdom kind of freak out. Well, how come Vashti says no? And by the way, she says no. Our wives are going to say no. We're all going to be in trouble. They were a bunch of whiners. Okay, that's chapter 1. Verse number 2. Chapter number 2. So now there's going to be a saying, decree going out that virgin young women will be brought to the king, and the king will pick from those virgins to be the next queen. And so we see that in verse 4, let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and did so. Verse number 5, now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew, so we have a Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Does anybody know any other son of Kish? All right, Saul, who was a Benjamite, right? Anybody recognize the name Shimei? That's the guy that kicked stones at David as he was leaving from Absalom. Was he not of the family of Saul? And then we have Jair, which that's kind of an obscure name. So why would Jair's name be placed in this lineage? Because it's an obscure name. Okay. So the obscure name here is Jair was actually the one in verse number 6 who had been carried away from Jerusalem. So history says Jair was the father of Mordecai. So Jair was taken in the Babylonian captivity, and then Mordecai was raised up in Babylon as a Jew. And now Ahasuerus is the son of Darius the Mede. Who was Darius the Mede? Okay, so Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. And then we have Nebuchadnezzar's son, which was Belshazzar. And then after him, who came in and conquered Babylon? Was it Darius the Mede? Cyrus came in, and then Darius took over, and now Ahasuerus is underneath Darius the Mede. That's the lineage that's going there. So, are there Jews in Babylon this whole time? And Mordecai is one of those, isn't he? A Jew. Did Mordecai ever rise up in Ahasuerus' palace? Did he ever raise up to be like an advisor to Ahasuerus? So like at the end of the story, right, I'm going to jump to the end. Haman gets killed. Mordecai moves into Haman's house, and Mordecai becomes an advisor to the king. Do you think Mordecai had an influence on Ahasuerus? And anybody else? He certainly did. So does not Persia at the time, did they not have a heavily influenced Jews or a heavy Jewish influence? You had Nehemiah and Ezra are peers in that group. Wasn't there a pretty good Jewish influence talking about Messiah? So now back in Matthew chapter 1, when we have these magi showing up, we have these wise men showing up, how did they know about the king being born, the king of Israel being born? Well, they had heard Daniel's prophecies. They had heard Daniel's prophecies through Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By the way, they saw the Son of God in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They wrote that one down. Seems like there's a fourth one in the furnace, and he has the appearance like unto the Son of Man, or Son of God. They wrote that down. And so the teaching here, the wise men had gotten the teaching from the Jewish influence that was in their country for years and years and years and years, and finally they saw the sign that was given. Now, what about the gifts? The three gifts have significance. The gold that was given to Jesus represents his royalty. Jesus is king. The incense or the frankincense is symbolic of the prayers of the high priest rising to heaven, and it tells of Jesus as the high priest. The myrrh is often used as a burial oil and foretells of Jesus' death. We talked about that a little while ago. He was born to die. By the way, the return of the wise men into Babylon in that area would have paved the way for the reception of the gospel when it reached there. Anybody we know make it that far? Anybody we know Damascus? Isn't that Turkey? Syria? Not Turkey. Yeah, Syria. Somebody's in Turkey. There's a city that's in Turkey. Is it Tarsus? Where did Jonah go down to? Joppa. He was supposed to go to Nineveh, but he went down to Joppa to run away from God. That's the whole account of the story. One of those is in Turkey. Tarsus is in Turkey, which is awful close to, anybody want to help me out here? Iraq? Persia. So that would be part of the Persian Empire. And so, when we talk about the wise men, number one, we ought to talk about the wise men, not necessarily kings. And we ought to talk about a hepa and not necessarily three. And we ought to talk about them going to the house and worshiping Jesus and not going to the manger. So you know what I'm going to get at? So Justin and his dad. Now, I've known Justin's dad for, how old are you? 30 years? 30 years? How old are you? You're 36? Yeah, about 30 years, 31 years. I've known them about that long. And at their home in Virginia, Justin's dad was going around. You guys remember those old VHS cameras? They're like this big, and you put a VHS tape into it, and you slap. You guys may not have seen one. In museums, they have these. And you can record straight onto the VHS tape. Well, that's what Justin's dad was doing. And he's going through the house and kind of showing the Christmas decorations and everything. And then he zooms in on his manger scene. And he's like, I want you to notice what's not at the manger scene. The wise men are not at the manger scene. The wise men, and he's panned across his living room, are over there. Because they weren't at the manger. That's when they started. And so you hear him preaching this whole thing on this VHS tape. And we still, we watched it several years ago, just got another good chuckle. By the way, is it on that same tape or is it another one? My pants. It's got to be another one, but it's that same time frame. I was young. I had not been called into the ministry yet, and I had on these flaming teal and purple paisley kind of sweatpants they were in at the time. And I had high-top tennis shoes on, not tied with the tongue sticking way out, and I'm standing right next to my pastor who's in khakis and a tie. I had to be called out of that. So anyways, that was that far back. But you know what? Who wasn't at the manger? The wise men weren't there. They were looking at the star still in Persia. And so, not to make a whole bunch of little Troyites, followers of Troy, which is Justin's dad, or me, but let's be followers of the Bible. And when you set up your manger scene, don't put wise men there. And if you get a manger scene, I would buy extra wise men and put like a whole troop of them way over here. All right, in all seriousness, any questions or comments about what we looked at tonight?